Abiding in God's presence is the foundation of a secure and peaceful life. When we dwell in the secret place of the Most High, we are positioning ourselves under His divine covering. This isn't just a casual visitation. It is a lifestyle of remaining close to Him, seeking His presence daily, and walking in constant communion with Him. The secret place represents intimacy with God, a place where we meet Him beyond the distractions of life. It is not a physical location, but a spiritual posture of trust and surrender. To abide means to remain, to stay, to make our home in Him. Many people visit God in moments of crisis, but abiding is about living in continuous fellowship with Him. It means seeking Him in the morning, walking with Him throughout the day, and resting in Him at night. It is an ongoing relationship, not a temporary refuge. When we abide in Him, we experience His peace, His wisdom, and His unshakable strength. Psalm 91 begins with a profound declaration: "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." This promise is not for everyone. It is for those who choose to dwell, those who remain near to God. The shadow of the Almighty represents His nearness, His protection, and His power. A shadow is only cast when something is close, which means to abide under His shadow. We must stay near to Him. Distance from God leaves us vulnerable, but closeness to Him ensures divine security. When we truly abide, we cultivate a heart of dependence on Him. Instead of running to God only when trouble comes, we learn to walk with Him daily, trusting Him in both the good and the difficult moments. Many people struggle with fear, anxiety, and uncertainty because they step in and out of God's presence instead of dwelling continually. The secret place is where we find reassurance that no matter what happens around us, we are covered by His mighty hand. In the Old Testament, the Holy of Holies was the most sacred place in the temple, where God's presence dwelled. Only the high priest could enter once a year. But through Christ, the veil has been torn, and we now have unrestricted access to God's presence. This means that the secret place is not reserved for a select few, but is available to all who seek Him. Abiding in God's presence requires intentionality. It is not something that happens automatically. It is a choice we make daily. Spending time in prayer, meditating on His Word, and worshiping Him are ways we cultivate that closeness. The more we abide, the more we recognize His voice, feel His peace, and experience His guidance. The enemy will always try to pull us away from the presence of God. Distractions, busyness, and worries of life can cloud our minds and weaken our connection with Him. But abiding means pushing past those obstacles, prioritizing God above all else, and making Him our dwelling place. When we do this, we begin to see His hand at work in every aspect of our lives. Moses understood the importance of abiding in God's presence. When God called him to lead Israel, Moses declared, "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here." He knew that without God's presence, victory was impossible. That same truth applies to us today. No matter how capable we think we are, our greatest strength comes from abiding in Him. The beauty of abiding is that it brings peace that surpasses all understanding. The world offers temporary solutions, but God provides lasting security. When we abide, we are not shaken by the storms of life because we are anchored in Him. No matter what challenges arise, we have the confidence that we are held safely under the shadow of the Almighty. Divine protection is one of the most powerful promises in Psalm 91. When we place our trust in God, He becomes our refuge, our shield, and our fortress. His protection is not limited by circumstances, human limitations, or the threats of the enemy. It is an unshakable covering that surrounds those who dwell in Him. This divine protection is not just physical, it extends to our spiritual, emotional, and mental well-being. God's covering is complete, guarding us from dangers we can see and those we cannot. The psalmist declares, "He shall cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you shall take refuge." This imagery speaks of the tender care of God, like a mother bird protecting her young. Just as a bird spreads its wings to shelter its chicks from storms and predators, God spreads His presence over His children. This covering is both gentle and powerful, offering safety in times of uncertainty. When we take refuge under his wings, we are not just protected, we are embraced by his love and security. God's protection is not dependent on our strength or ability. He is the one who fights for us, defends us, and keeps us safe. Many people live in fear, constantly worried about what might happen next. But when we truly trust in God's protection, we shift from fear to faith. The enemy wants us to live in anxiety, doubting whether God will come through for us. But God's promises are sure, and his faithfulness never fails. The psalm continues, "You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day." This verse reminds us that dangers exist, but we do not have to live in fear. The world is filled with uncertainties, unexpected trials, and unseen threats, but none of these can overpower God's protection. Whether it is an attack of the enemy, a sudden crisis, or the pressures of life, God remains our shield. There are countless examples throughout Scripture where God's divine protection is evident. When Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, it was God who shut the mouths of the lions. When the Israelites faced the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, it was God who parted the waters and led them safely through. When David faced Goliath, it was not his strength, but God's power that secured the victory. These stories are not just historical events, they are reminders of how God protects those who trust in him. One of the greatest aspects of divine protection is that it covers us even when we are unaware. There are dangers we may never see, attacks that never reach us, and plans of the enemy that are stopped before they can take effect. God's hand is always at work, shielding us from harm. Sometimes we may question why difficulties still come our way, but even in trials, his protection is present. He allows challenges not to harm us, but to strengthen our faith and reveal his glory. Trusting in divine protection does not mean we will never face battles. It means we never face them alone. God goes before us, making a way where there seems to be none. He stands behind us as our rear guard, ensuring that no attack takes us by surprise. He surrounds us on every side, keeping us safe in ways we cannot fully comprehend. The more we walk in faith, the more we recognize his hand shielding us from harm. The enemy will try to convince us that we are vulnerable, that we are unprotected, and that danger is greater than God's power. But the truth is, no weapon formed against us shall prosper. When we remain in him, his angels are commanded concerning us, keeping us from stumbling. This supernatural covering is not a temporary shield. It is an everlasting promise to those who trust in the Lord. Fearless faith is the key to walking in the fullness of God's promises. Psalm 91 reminds us that when we trust in God completely, we are not shaken by fear, uncertainty, or the trials of life. Fear is one of the greatest weapons the enemy uses to weaken faith, create doubt, and keep people from stepping into God's divine protection and provision. But when faith replaces fear, we experience the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing God is in control. The psalmist declares, "You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day." This verse speaks directly to the fears that grip many hearts, fears of the unknown, fears of attack, fears of failure, and fears of danger. These fears can be paralyzing, keeping people from living in the peace and assurance God intends for them. But faith is the antidote to fear. When we place our full trust in God, we recognize that he is greater than anything that comes against us. Fear often arises when we focus on circumstances rather than on God's promises. The enemy whispers lies, trying to make situations seem more powerful than God's protection. But throughout Scripture, God continuously reminds his people not to fear. When Joshua was stepping into his calling as the leader of Israel, God told him, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." This command was not based on Joshua's strength, but on God's presence. The same is true for us today. Fear has no hold when we know that God is with us. There are moments in life when fear feels overwhelming, but those are the moments when faith must rise. The story of Peter walking on water is a perfect example. As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he walked in the miraculous. But the moment he looked at the waves, fear took hold, and he began to sink. Fear causes us to sink, but faith keeps us standing. When we fix our focus on God, fear loses its power, and we can move forward in boldness and confidence. Psalm 91 is filled with promises that should strengthen our faith. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. This is a declaration of God's protection in the midst of danger. Faith believes that even when chaos surrounds us, we are safe in God's hands. Fear sees the battle and trembles, but faith sees God's power and stands firm. Fearless faith does not mean we will never face difficulties. It means we trust God even when difficulties arise. The 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to bow to an idol. They did not know if God would deliver them from the fire, but they stood in faith, knowing that God was in control. In the end, the fire did not harm them because the Son of God was with them. Faith does not always remove the fire, but it ensures that we are never alone in it. The enemy will always try to introduce fear into our hearts. He will use circumstances, negative thoughts, and even other people's opinions to plant doubt. But when we meditate on God's promises, faith strengthens, and fear is cast out. The Bible tells us, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. This means fear does not come from God, and if it does not come from Him, we do not have to accept it. When we develop fearless faith, we step into a life of trust and peace. We no longer react to every challenge with anxiety, but instead, we stand firm in the knowledge that God is in control. Faith is not based on what we see, but on what God has spoken. When we trust Him completely, we walk with boldness, knowing that nothing can stand against us when He is for us.